Hey guys, recently one of you asked me a question which was, how do I create high quality artwork using fine art supplies that are archival and light fast but on a budget? So while I have a chat to you about that, I wanted to show you my process of creating this watercolour Highland cow, just to give you something interesting to look at while I have a chat to you guys. So let's get into it. I'm Kirsty Rebecca and I make drawing and painting tutorials that are easy to follow even if you're just starting out. I know how hard it can be to create artwork if you don't have spare money to spend on supplies, especially if you're young or just starting out. And I've seen a lot of videos on this topic of creating art on a budget where the main suggestion is to buy cheaper supplies. I'm not going to tell you to go buy a cheap set of coloured pencils or acrylic paints from the dollar store. I focus on using archival, artist quality supplies. And these supplies will give you better results, are easier to use and are light fast, so they won't fade in a few years' time, and this is really important if you're planning on selling your work. In general, one of the cheapest mediums that you can start with if you're planning on selling your work is graphite, and I started as a teenager with a small set of graphite pencils and a cheap drawing pad that was acid-free and artist quality. When I was young, I received these kinds of art supplies at Christmas time, or my birthday, because it was a relatively inexpensive gift, and I used graphite for many years before having enough money to buy something different. And there are also some other interesting pencils like tinted graphite, charcoal and tinted charcoal, and I believe Derwent make all of these as well, that are relatively inexpensive if you buy the smaller sets. And if you can't buy an entire set of graphite pencils, you can just buy 3 pencils by themselves, like an HB, a 4B, and an 8B. So you have a lighter value, a medium value, and a darker value, and then all you need is an eraser and a pad of drawing paper, and you can create some amazing artwork just with those 3 pencils. If you want to work with acrylics, oils, or watercolour, I would definitely not recommend buying dollar store paints or canvases because it just doesn't give you the same results. It's also not archival and the paints tend to crack off and peel off the canvas, and the canvases themselves can warp. And the paints are also very hard to work with, they just don't have the same consistency as artist quality paints. Instead, I would recommend starting out with just black and white, and this is a great way to get the feel for the medium and learn how important values are in your work. You can make a really realistic piece using just black and white, and then once you're more comfortable with that or you have a bit of spare money, add a blue, a red and a yellow and maybe like a burnt umber or a dark brown of some sort. And with those 3 or 4 colours and black and white, you can create any colour from the colour wheel just by mixing them, and it's a great way to practice doing that so that you know which colours to mix together to make other colours before you start adding in more and more colours to your sets. With acrylic paint, I actually use some of the Liquitex Basics, which are a student quality paint, but they're actually light fast and they use the same pigments as other artists or professional grade paints. They're just a bit more transparent, which is perfect for the way that I work. And I'm not sure about any other student quality brands, but I know Liquitex Basics are great and they're inexpensive and an archival way to go. Watercolour paints also have student quality brands, and I personally have some of the Van Gogh watercolours, which are a student grade as well, but they are made by Royal Talons, who also make Rembrandt, Sakura, amongst other brands as well. And these student grade watercolours are mostly light fast and have a fantastic beginner set if you are looking to start out. Winsor & Newton and many other brands also have student grade paints that are worth checking out as well. With oil paints, they can be a bit more expensive, especially if you're buying mixing mediums or paint thinner to go with it, but you can start out with just black and white or those 5 or 6 basic colours that I mentioned earlier instead of buying a full set. And with oil painting, you don't actually need to have any of those additional mediums. I would recommend getting some sort of paint thinner or odourless mineral spirit so you can wash up your brushes and thin your paint that way, but you don't need any of these alkyd oils or linseed oils or anything like that if you're just starting out. You can create an entire piece just using paint thinner and oil paint alone. Whichever medium you choose, there's 2 benefits to buying those 5 or 6 primary colours only, and one is that it's way less expensive than buying a full set, and it also means that you're forced to mix your own colours, and this is important when you're first starting out because it can be really tricky to learn. If you buy hundreds of colours, you'll never learn to mix any colours very well, and it can impact what you choose to paint or how your final piece looks. It's beneficial to know how to mix the exact colour that you're looking for, so it comes naturally during your painting process, which makes it a lot more fun and relaxing. In terms of canvases for acrylic or oil paints, I would recommend starting with a canvas pad, and you can get a lot of them that are paper that is made with the texture of canvas, but I recommend one by Fredericks, which is actually cotton canvas but in a pad. So this is a very inexpensive way to practice, and you can actually stretch this canvas on stretcher bars afterwards if you really like the piece because it was done on an archival canvas. If you are still wanting a proper canvas or a wood panel, I would recommend waiting for a sale at your local art store or online and buy a few because it can get quite expensive. And I wouldn't recommend buying any canvas designed for craft or children, and definitely not from a dollar store, especially if you're planning on selling your work. It's definitely worth it in the long run just to wait for better brands to be on sale and purchase those when they're a little bit cheaper rather than buying bulk cheap canvases. When it comes to watercolour, make sure that you buy watercolour paper. Don't just use printer paper or any paper that you have laying around because it just doesn't work the same. Look for 100% cotton paper that is archival or pH neutral. It can get a bit pricey, but you can buy smaller pads that are postcard size when there are sales, and start small while you're learning. If you're starting in pastels, it can get a bit more expensive than other mediums when you're starting out because it's harder to actually blend your colors together, meaning that you'll need to collect pretty much every color that you want to use. But I would recommend buying a set of pan pastels, just a small set of 5 or 10, and then a set of pastel pencils like the Carbothello or the Faber-Castell Pitt pastels. Pan pastels are easily mixed, and I'll link a video below that shows you how you can do that, so you don't have to buy a full set. You can just buy a 5 or 10. Whereas if you try and buy soft pastel sticks to start with, it can get really expensive because you'll need to buy a pretty large set to be able to create any of the pieces that you want to create. Whereas pan pastels are very different because they're a compressed pastel in a pan that you can apply with a tool, and you can actually mix the colors on a separate piece of paper first and then apply them from there. And that way you can start out with the minimal set and be able to have a really wide range of colors. And if you wanted to create work that is a bit more detailed, that's when I recommend using the pastel pencils, just to add that extra detail on top of the pan pastels. But if you did want your work to look a bit more impressionistic and you didn't need those details, then you don't need to have those pastel pencils on top of the pan pastels. And if you can't afford to buy an entire set of pastel pencils, you can just pick a few single pencils out that you're going to use for your next project and then slowly build up your set from there. And it's the same deal with pastels as well. You can just buy black and white and then learn to mix your pan pastels and pastel pencils that way before you introduce any colours into your work. For the surface for pastels, I use pastel matte paper, which you can buy in pads or full sheets. You can actually buy single sheets of pastel matte if you want to try it out, which can be a less expensive way to go if you can't afford to buy the pads. And not all paper that's labelled as pastel paper will work the same. I use the Clairefontaine pastel matte because it's got a really fine grit, almost like a sandpaper, and it really helps you layer that pastel really well. So I wouldn't recommend buying any of the cheaper pastel papers. It'll just make it really hard to be able to layer and create the same sort of detail and effects. Coloured pencils is the same deal. You can actually create almost anything with a basic set of 12 colours. So don't go and buy the biggest set of colours from the dollar store or the craft store. They don't work the same as the major artist quality brands. It's much better to buy a 12 set of professional colours than 100 crappy colours. A few coloured pencil brands that I like to use are the Caran d'Ache Luminance, which are probably the most expensive. There's Derwent Pro Colour, Derwent Lightfast and Derwent Drawing, the Faber-Castell Polychromos and the Prismacolor Premiere, and there's also Lyra Rembrandt. And I actually go through and pick out the colours that are not Lightfast based on the company's Lightfast charts, which are either on their website or on the box or on the pencils, and I take those out of the set so that I don't use them in my artwork, so that I'm not compromising the archival quality. Whichever set that you choose, I always recommend the Derwent Drawing Chinese White as a single pencil by itself because it's the most opaque white that I've found, and it really comes in useful with coloured pencils. So with the pastel pencils and coloured pencils, you can just buy the 12 set of colours and then learn to mix your colours by layering. You can pretty much create any artwork that you like just with those 12 colours. And there are many different options of paper for coloured pencils. I use Clairefontaine Pastel Matte for coloured pencils as well as pastel pencils, but sometimes I also use watercolour paper for coloured pencils. There are a few options out there that other artists use. Just make sure that the paper you choose is artist quality and acid free and doesn't yellow over time. Just be mindful that if you choose a paper that looks a little bit rough, you'll probably see that grainy texture with your coloured pencils in the end. Whichever medium you choose to start out with, if you're trying to sell your artwork and you want your artwork to last many years to come and you want to charge a price that matches that, then I would highly recommend just starting with black and white, because you can create some amazing artworks in grayscale. So learn how to mix that medium and how to layer it and how to work with it before adding more and more colours as you go along. I've created a playlist on the screen that I thought you might enjoy, so click on that and I'll see you over there.